Elihu, Job's friend, insists that Job thinks he is more righteous than God. And he utterly denies this. Then Elihu speaks on God's behalf. Let's open up the Bible and think on these things. This is the Word of Truth Ministry video library. I am Nathan C. Johnson, Bible teacher. I greet you in the faith and fellowship of our great God and Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, whose we are, whom we love, and whom we serve. Let's open our Bibles this morning to the book of Job, chapter 35, where we are continuing our consideration of Elihu, Job's fourth friend, younger than the other three. And remember, he listened patiently while the older men, Job and his three friends, spoke, but he has been angered. He's been angered by Job for justifying himself rather than God, and he's been angered by Job's friends for finding no answer for Job and therefore condemning God. He condemns Job's friends since they would have had Job approach God and say, "I stopped sinning, so now you have to bless me," insisting that God deal with him on his terms, which isn't correct. But he also insists that Job is wrong. He gave his first address to Job in Job chapter 33. Then he gave his address to Job's friends in Job chapter 34. And now he gives his second address to Job in Job chapter 35. So we will continue our consideration of the book of Job in Job chapter 35. And I'll be reading as usual from Bullinger's excellent translation of the book of Job. So Job 35 and verse 1, Elihu further spake to Job and said. So again, like I said, Elihu is now making a second address to Job. Verse 2, Dost thou count this sound judgment? Thou didst say, My righteousness surpasseth that of God. So he says, do you count this as sound judgment? And judgment there, King James makes it right, but it is the Hebrew word mishpat, which means judgment. Do you count this sound judgment, sound determination of what's right? To say, my righteousness surpasses that of God, El, the mighty God? I'm more righteous than he. Do you call that sound judgment, Job? He says, because that's what you've been saying. Verse 3, Yea, thou dost ask, what is the gain to thee? And shall I profit more than by my sin? So he says, Job, you've said, I was righteous and yet it didn't do me any good. God did all these horrible things to me anyway. So it really did me no good to be righteous. Could have gotten the same result if I'd sinned. So he'd made out that there was no profit in being righteous over sinning. Verse 4, I, even I, will make reply to thee, and with thee to these friends of thine as well. So he says, I'm going to reply to you. That means in Hebrew, I'm going to return speech to you, Job. And he says, I'm going to answer you, and while I'm doing it, I'm going to answer your friends as well. Because you both come to the same conclusion. And that is, when their argument was defeated, that Job must have done something wrong to deserve what happened to him, why they would have therefore come to the same conclusion as Job, which was that God had done something unrighteous by having this happen to Job. So, again, making themselves out to be more righteous than God, since they could see what God did wasn't right. Verse 5, Look up unto the heavens, consider them, survey the skies so high above thy head. So he says to Job and his three friends, look up and consider the heavens. Of course, that means the sky above the sun, moon, stars, and planets out beyond that. He says, consider that great realm above you, high above your head. Verse 6, If thou hast sinned, what doest thou to him? Be thy sins many, what dost thou to him? So he says, if you sin, if you do something wrong, what have you done to God? This God who is up beyond the sky, who made that vast universe out there that you can see. What have you done to him when you sinned? How did you harm him? How did you hurt him? How is he harmed by what you did? And then he says, be thy sins many. Now the second time sins there is transgressions or rebellions. If you rebel a lot against him, do you really think your tiny rebellion can harm the God of the universe who made all that? What can your tiny rebellion do to him? Verse 7, if thou art just, what dost thou give to him? Or from thy hand what gift will he receive? So he says, if you are just, if you're righteous, well, how does that benefit him? Your sin doesn't hurt him. Your righteousness doesn't benefit him either. Can you give something to God that will benefit him? So his argument is, look, if your sin doesn't really affect God and your righteousness doesn't really affect God, well, there's nothing that could make God corrupt, is there? There's nothing that would make him take the side of the wicked. Why would he? Why would he not do justice when it doesn't really harm or help him either way? Why would he do anything except what's exactly right? Of course, human judges will sometimes do the wrong thing because they think it benefits them. In some way, they want something out of it. They want something besides what's just and right. But what could God possibly want? He has everything. Why would he not do justice? Verse 8, thy sin may hurt a mortal like thyself. Thy righteousness may profit one like thee. So he says that your wickedness might hurt a man like you. And that's the Hebrew ish, just a normal person like you. And your righteousness may profit a son of man. In Hebrew, that's Ben Adam. A son of Adam. Yeah, your sins might hurt a son of Adam. Your righteousness might profit a son of Adam. But that's because they're, of course, so much less than God. God's above all that. So when he judges, it can't be affected by personal benefit or loss. Because how can he benefit or lose from our sin or righteousness? Verse 9, men make an outcry when they are oppressed. They cry for help when neath the tyrant's power. So he says, quite rightfully, when people are oppressed, they cry out for aid. They cry out to those who may be strong enough that they think they can do something about it, and they cry out to God. God, don't let this injustice continue. Save me from it. Verse 10, but no one saith, where is my Maker, God, who giveth songs to us in sorrow's night? He says, no one, meaning probably most oppressed ones. There's Hebrew figure speech where you put everyone for the greater part. He says, no one says, where is Eloah? Eloah is the venerable God, the God who is worthy of being worshipped. No one says in their oppression, where is Eloah? Where's my Maker? How come he's not doing something about it? He gives us songs to sing in sorrow's night. Even when we're in sorrow, he gives us a song. Verse 11, and teacheth us beyond the beasts of the earth, and makes us wiser than the fowl of heaven. So God teaches us more than he teaches the animals and birds. Why are human beings not like animals? Why are we so much smarter? Why are we so much above? Well, because God taught us above what he taught the animals. He gave us knowledge above those he gave to the brute beasts. Now, these are the beasts of the earth. Hebrew there is eretz, which could be earth, but also could be land. The Bible talks about in creation the beasts of the dry land, the birds of the air, and the fish of the sea, the three realms that God filled with creatures. So these would be the beasts, the animals of the earth, and makes us wiser than the fowls of heaven. Again, the birds of the sky. And here it is, the sky, heaven means the sky, where the birds fly, as opposed to the land or the earth, where the beasts walk. Verse 12, but the true reason why he answereth not, although they cry, is evildoers' pride. So he says, why does God not answer the cry of the oppressed? Because they don't seek the God worthy of worship? Ultimately, it's because of their pride. The pride of those who do evil, that is calamity-causing works. Now consider this, that even the best among us, We've all done things that cause calamity. We've all done wrong. We've all done sin. And ultimately, many people come to God and say, God, you've got to do something about this. You've got to straighten this out. In pride, as if God has to obey our orders. He has to do what we tell him he has to do. He says pride is ultimately the reason God doesn't answer the oppressed. Because they don't come in humility. They don't come subjected to God and his will. They come in pride. Verse 13, for vanity God will in no wise hear, nor will the Almighty hold it in regard. So God will not listen to vanity. And vanity, again, is the idea of the Old English word is of emptiness. And in Pilgrim's Progress, when John Bunyan wrote about Vanity Fair, he didn't mean pride fair. Today we use vanity for someone who's proud. They're vain. Well, that's not what he meant, but vanity meant emptiness. Vanity Fair means emptiness fair. And it has to do with all the empty pursuits of this world. But God is not going to listen to empty calls for help from those who are proud and insist they deserve it. Nor will the Almighty hold it in regard. That is, Almighty is El Shaddai. El being the mighty powerful God, and Shaddai being the generous giving God. God of gifts and giving out. So El Shaddai, the mighty giving God, will not regard empty cries for help from the proud. He won't listen. Verse 14, how much less then, when thou dost say to him, I see him not, he doth not hear my cry. So if God won't hear the oppressed when they cry to him, just because they cry proudly and emptily, insisting that God ought to do what they say he should do, well, how much less, he says, is God going to answer you when you say, well, I don't see God coming to help me, so therefore he's not hearing me. He doesn't hear me. He doesn't know what's happening to me. He's not paying attention. He's not just. Well, but God is the God of justice. And Job ought to be patient and wait for him. Not insist that if God isn't responding just like he wants him to, he must not be hearing. So he says, yet judgment is before him, therefore wait. He said, wait for God's judgment, Job. Don't be so impatient. Don't be insisting that God is never going to judge you. He's never going to put this right just because he hasn't yet. Job, you're impatient and showing your pride. Verse 15, but now, because he hath not punished thee, thou sayest, his anger doth not visit sin, nor strictly mark widespread iniquity. So this is very interesting. Notice this, that Elihu says that God has not punished Job. He says, because he has not punished you. Well, remember what the three friends were saying. The three friends were saying that everything that's happened to you, Job, is God punishing you. God is punishing you, Job. Elihu says, God isn't punishing you, Job. When you dared to say that God didn't hear you, when you dared to say that God is unjust, he doesn't give sin its punishment. He doesn't notice widespread iniquity. He doesn't do anything about it. When you said such things, you deserve punishment, and he didn't punish you. And now, because he didn't punish you for saying such things as that he didn't hear you and he's not doing justice for you, well then you say, see, he doesn't punish iniquity. Because if he did, he would have punished me. Verse 16, Thus Job doth fill his mouth with vanity, and without knowledge multiplieth words. So he accuses Job, Job, you're just filling your mouth with empty talk and multiplying words without knowledge to claim that God doesn't do what is right and just. He doesn't bring sin and iniquity its righteous recompense of reward. Well, you're just speaking empty things there, Job. And you think just because God doesn't punish you for saying such things, that he doesn't punish iniquity. But he says he does. Now Elihu continues in chapter 36. And in chapter 36, I would say we have Elihu now speaks to Job and his friends on God's behalf. He pleads for God. Job 36, verse 1, Elihu also proceeded and said. So he continued, now he's going to speak for God. Verse 2, bear with me while I briefly make thee see there are yet words to say on God's behalf. He says, bear with me, continue with me for a while. I've been speaking for a while already. He's already spoken for 3 chapters. But he wants to speak some more, and he wants to speak words on God's behalf. Now, God there is Eloah, again, the venerable God, the God who's worthy of worship. And he says, you have accused God, there are words to say on his behalf, and I'm going to say them. Verse 3, my knowledge I shall gather from afar, and to my Maker righteousness ascribe. So he says, I'm going to gather knowledge from afar. I'm not just going to depend on my own knowledge, but gathering knowledge from afar. And the result of my knowledge gathered is to ascribe to my Maker righteousness. You and your 3 friends, Job, have insisted that God is unrighteous in what he's done to you. And yet I'm going to ascribe to him righteousness, not injustice like you do. Verse 4, for truly nothing false is in my words. The omniscient one it is who deals with thee. So he says, I'm not going to say anything untrue. I'm not going to say anything false. And then he says, the omniscient one is he who deals with thee. So he points out to Job, look, you have insisted that God hasn't done what's right to you. That he's treated you like you're wicked when you're righteous, and that wasn't right. But I've already showed you, God isn't such a person as could be corrupted in judgment. Nothing would induce him to be unjust. But I also point out to you that God knows everything. Now, sometimes our judges can make the wrong judgment, not because they're corrupt, but just because they're ignorant. They don't know all the facts. They don't know everything. So they think they're making right judgment, but they're messing up because there are things they don't know. But he says God is omniscient. He knows everything. So he's not going to mess up for that reason either. Verse 5, lo, God is great, but naught doth he despise. In power great, in wisdom great is he. So he says, lo, God is great. And this really is Elihu's great proclamation. This is his theme. This is his conclusion, is that God is great. Now, God here is El, the mighty God, the powerful God. El. He says, God is great, but not that he despises. He doesn't despise us, even though we're so much less than he is. He is so far above us, there's an infinite distance. And yet God doesn't despise us even so. He is great in power. He is great in wisdom. Verse 6, he will not let the wicked ever live, but he will right the cause of the oppressed. And what he says here is true. When God's kingdom comes, we know that the wicked will not be allowed to live there. And so he might allow the wicked to live for a time here, but wait until the kingdom comes. Wait until that day. And then you'll see that God will not allow the wicked to just keep on living in their wickedness. But he will right the cause of the oppressed. And King James has poor, that is wretched or oppressed. So what is Elihu doing? Well, he is not just looking at this world, is he? He's not just looking at the current circumstances. He's not just looking at the way things are now. He's taking the long view. He's taking the ultimate view. He's thinking about God's ultimate judgment, not just the temporary things that happen in this life. But what is the permanent thing going to be? What is God going to do in his coming kingdom? As opposed to what's happening right now. Well, when you take the long view and view his kingdom, he's not going to let the wicked live there. And he's not going to let the oppressed continue to be oppressed. He's going to right their cause. Verse 7, and not take from a righteous man his eyes. He seateth them with kings upon the throne. He makes them sit in glory raised on high. So he is always watching over the righteous. And we'll see that in his kingdom. We'll see how he watches over the righteous. We'll see how he doesn't allow the wicked to harm them in any way. And when his time comes, what's he going to do? He's going to sit the righteous on thrones like kings or with kings. And remember, this is what God is going to do to us. We're going to be seated with Christ in heavenly places, which would be better translated among the most exalted. He is going to seat us with him. who are going to be seated with kings. He sits them in glory, makes them sit in glory, high esteem, raised on high. Now the King James says forever, but that is not the usual Hebrew word olam, which means for the outflow or perpetually or for the kingdom. But this is a different word. He seats them in eminence, or Bullinger makes it, he seats them on high. It's not the word olam, which is forever at all. So they sit in glory raised on high. Verse 8, and if they be in iron fetters bound, or if they be held fast in sorrow's bonds. So the righteous, they might not now be seated on thrones. The righteous might now be imprisoned. Or though they might not be literally in prison, they might be bound by sorrows. You know, people can be bound by physical bonds, or people can be bound by bonds you can't see. Bonds of sorrow. Loss that they just can't get over. They suffer from the rest of their lives. Or as I've said many times, by ideas. Some people live a worse life because of the ideas they're bound by than they would live just if they were bound as a prisoner. So he says, the righteous might be bound in iron fetters, a prisoner, or they might be bound in sorrow's bonds, bound by sorrow and can't get free. Verse 9, it is that he may show them their deeds, and their transgressions which have sprung from pride. So why does God allow this to happen to righteous people? So that they can see their deeds and their rebellions. See, the problem is the more righteous we get, the more likely we are to overlook our sins and the wrong things we've done and the ways we've rebelled against God. The Bible tells us that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, that none is righteous, no, not one. And we all need to be shown the reality of our sin. Even those who try and struggle to do right need to understand that we don't always do right. We are sinners. We are rebels against God. So sometimes when God allows us to be prisoners or bound by sorrows, it's to show us that so we could consider our deeds and consider, I would like to say, I don't deserve this, but we should consider the fact that we're all sinners. Verse 10, thus openeth he their ear, and doth instruct and warn them from iniquity to turn. So he says this is how he causes them to listen to his warnings and to turn them from iniquity. By sorrow and oppression, they realize their need for God and their unworthiness of all God gives them. And it warns them, turn away from iniquity, the things that would get God against you. Verse 11, then if they hearken and obey his voice, they in prosperity shall spend their days, and end their years in peace and pleasantness. So he says if they listen and obey God when he warns them through affliction, well then their days will end well. And of course, he means, again, ultimately in God's kingdom. In God's kingdom, all will be well for them. Verse 14, should they not heed, they perish by the sword, and die not knowing how it is or why. So if they won't listen to God, if they won't listen to his warning to turn from iniquity, and do turn to iniquity, well then he says they're going to come to a violent end. They're going to perish by the sword, and not even know what happened to them. Verse 13, but hypocrites in heart will heap up wrath, because they cry not when he bindeth them. So the hypocrites in heart, remember hypocrites, the idea is an actor or a pretender. He only pretends to care about God and righteousness. He only cares about himself. He's a hypocrite. Well, he says they gather God's anger because they don't fear the warnings that he gives them. Verse 14, wherefore they die while they are yet in youth. Their life is spent among polluted ones. He says, wherefore they die, but the Hebrew for they is nephesh. The word for a soul. Their souls die. And yes, in the Bible, souls can die. They're subject to death. It's only in English where we've been so affected by Greek philosophy that they'll translate that away and make it sound like souls can't die. But souls can. The Bible says so. Their souls will die while they're yet in youth, while they're yet young. And their life is spent among polluted ones. Now, polluted ones, that's the Hebrew word for a male prostitute. And male prostitutes, this was something that was done in the pagan worship, in Canaanite worship. And that is that one way you could worship some of these gods of corruption and sexual hedonism and so forth, is that you'd go and you'd visit the prostitutes and you'd pay your fee, and that would be a donation to the gods. And they didn't just have female prostitutes, they also had male ones. Now these were at least bisexual, if not just out and out homosexual, male prostitutes. So he says those who don't heed God's warning might end up among these polluted male prostitutes. Verse 15, yet he doth save the poor in all his woes, and openeth their ear in their distress. So he saves the wretched in all their woes. And he opens their ear in their distress. So when trouble happens to them, he allows them to hear his warnings, so that good comes in the end. I noticed some things about this. One is that we're seeing that the Canaanites had already started their great wickedness in the time of Job. We can also see how Elihu's words are much more comforting to Job than those of his friends. He's suggesting to Job, your sufferings can open your ears to God's warnings against iniquity and lead to deliverance. It's not that you should admit you did something wrong, but that you should consider God through all this and turn to him, trust in him, and learn to reject iniquity, including the pride of what you've said, saying that it doesn't benefit anyone to serve God. And if you'll listen, well, then he'll save you. Verse 16, thus in like manner he would thee allure, and from the mouth of trouble draw thee out into a pleasant place. No trouble there, thy table well prepared with richest food. So he suggests that God is treating you this way, Job. He is alluring you through these troubles. He's calling you to himself. And he would love to draw you out of the mouth of this trouble. He's not necessarily saying God put him into this trouble, but his goal in the trouble is to get Job to consider him and turn from iniquity. And if he will listen to God, he'll draw him out into a pleasant place where there is no trouble, and a table is prepared with the best of food. He says God would love to enjoy, to restore your pleasant life to you, your joy and your pleasure and your good and pleasant life to you, Job. He would love to do that. That's what he wants to do. And we'll see that Elihu is right. That's just what God did. Verse 17, but if with sinners' pleadings thou be filled, judgment and justice will lay hold on thee. So he says, if you keep pleading with the sinners' pleas, you're making their argument for them, as you have been doing, saying it does no good to be righteous, you might as well be sinful. Well, he says, then judgment and justice will lay hold on you instead. And, of course, they lay hold on you for your harm, not your good. Now note, Elihu isn't claiming, like the other three friends were, that judgment and justice have already laid hold on Job. See, they said, you did something wrong and judgment and justice have laid hold on you. Now, Elihu says, you've done something wrong. What he did wrong was claiming to be righteous and claiming that God was wrong. You're right and God's wrong. And if you keep doing that, well, then judgment and justice will lay hold on you. They haven't yet. Verse 18, for there is wrath, beware then of its stroke, for then a ransom great will not suffice. So he says there's wrath for those who continue in the way of sinners, who say such things as it doesn't benefit anyone to serve God. He says if you keep on this path, Job, even a great ransom won't save you. Verse 19, nor treasure turn the threatened stroke aside, nor precious ore avail, nor all thy strength. So he says treasure and ore won't buy off God's punishment if you keep on this path of siding with sinners, siding with their claims it doesn't do you good to serve God. Verse 20, oh, long not for the night of death, in which whole nations get upheaved from out their place. So now he speaks to the fact that Job is long for death. He says how attractive death seems to him. He wants to die to be freed from all his troubles. He says, don't long for death. Don't do that, Job. Now notice he says death doesn't just apply to people, but it also applies to whole nations. And that's true. There are whole nations that have died. Consider ancient Egypt. Egypt got very popular some years back with Egyptology, and everyone wanted to research Egypt. But Egypt, that old nation, the leading nation in the days after the flood, why they so died out and they were so forgotten. I know there's a nation called Egypt today, but they don't remember ancient Egypt. They aren't ancient Egypt. And their culture and their people were so forgotten that even their language, their written language, people for a long time thought it was just pictures, some kind of religious symbols. It wasn't even a language at all because they couldn't interpret it. Of course, until the Rosetta Stone came along and had languages side by side, including Egyptian. Whoops. Guess it was a language after all. But there was a nation that died. It died so much that not only didn't they speak their language anymore, they didn't even recognize. It was a language, they'd forgotten it so badly. So he says, don't long for death like happens to people and nations. Verse 21, take heed, regard not thou iniquity, for this thou didst prefer to all thy woes. He says, be careful, Job. You're regarding iniquity by your arguments, and you should stick with your original path. Remember, what was Job's original path? What did he do at first? Well, you didn't follow iniquity. When trouble happened, you said, I won't sin against the Lord. I won't accuse him. I won't speak against him. But now you're seeming to go the way of the wicked. Don't do that, Job. Verse 22, lo, God will be exalted in his power. Who can convey instruction like to him? So this is God, El, the mighty God, the God in all his power and strength. He is very powerful and he's exalted in his power. And who can convey instruction like to him? Well, there's no instructor greater than he, of course. He's the greatest instructor of all. Verse 23, who is it that assigns to him his way? Or who can say to him, thou hast done wrong? No one can assign to God a way. Say, God, you have to take this path. God, here's what you need to do, and give him instructions. No one can do that. Nor can anyone reprove him for doing wrong. Bad God. Don't do that anymore. No one can do that. Can't possibly do that. Remember, that's what Job tried to do. He tried to rebuke God for having done something wrong. Elihu says you can't do that. Verse 24, remember that thou shouldst extol his work, which men have contemplated and have sung. He said you should extol his works. You should magnify them and lift them up, not be speaking against them. And men have contemplated and sung about these things. Men here is enosh, the Hebrew word meaning mortal men subject to death. He says, men have sung about the greatness of God's works. That's what you should do, Job, not speak against them. Verse 25, yea, all have gazed in wonder thereupon, and mortal man beholds it from afar. So he says, yea, all men have gazed in wonder thereupon, and that first man is Adam. All of Adam's race has gazed in wonder on God's works, he says. And mortal man, that's enosh, mortal man subject to death, behold his works from afar. And we can only see his works as if it were from a great distance. We don't really understand them. We can't really inspect them because we don't really have the knowledge to even really fully understand his works and how great they are. Yet certainly all wonder over the greatness of his works, and who can help but wonder over the greatness of the creation around us. So Elihu points out that Job has argued that he is more righteous than God, insisting that he knows God has done wrong and he's in the right. Well, Elihu insists that cannot be true. First of all, men might twist justice when they can benefit from it, but God can get no benefit. He's not harmed by sin or benefited by righteousness. So since he can get no benefit, of course he judges fairly. Yes, why doesn't God answer the cry of the oppressed at times? He says because of their pride, which was Job's problem. The Lord himself is going to accuse Job of pride later on. He goes on to plead for God, Elihu does. He says God is not only perfect in justice, but also in knowledge. So he can't be wrong in his judgment because he doesn't know everything. He does know everything. Now he says when he allows affliction on the righteous, it's to show them their own sinfulness and warn them to turn and not go the way of the wicked. He says that's the warning you should be taking, Job, rather than following the way of the wicked by accusing God of having done something wrong. Well, we'll do one more session on Elihu and see what else he says in his argument on God's behalf in our next study. Thank you for joining us here today. If you have enjoyed this video, please press like below and comment. It helps promote our videos. So thank you again for joining us until we gather again around the pages of God's book. I bid you goodbye.